There are records that don't survive. Not always because someone set fire to them, though that happens. Not always because the paper crumbled to dust, though that does too. But because the people whose job it was to keep them looked at what they'd written, looked again, and then quietly closed the drawer and never opened it afterward. A note before this one begins. If the kind of thing you're about to hear is something you'd want more of, I've gathered 10 of them into an audiobook. The Hollow Files. 5 hours, 10 counties. Same voice you're listening to right now. The link is in the description and pinned at the top of the comments. Now then, the story. Before we go any further, do me a small favor. Tell me where you're listening from. Just the town, or the country if you'd rather. I read every single one, and it matters more than you'd think when you're alone in a small room telling a story like this. Leave it in the comments. I'll wait for you thereafter. This happened in the autumn of '81, in a stretch of west-central Pennsylvania that doesn't appear on most road maps anymore. The valley had a name once. They called it Yarrow Pass. There was a post office, a general store, a Methodist meeting house with a bell you could hear from 3 ridges over on a quiet morning. 312 people lived there, mostly farmers. A blacksmith by the name of Cassius Renfro, a widowed seamstress called Loveday Penhallow, a tinsmith named Obed Pickersgill, 2 midwives, the Hupshire sisters, Verley and Mahonry, a constable who wasn't paid enough to do the job and so mostly didn't. The kind of small place you'd find 100 of in those hills back then, and which the railroads were already passing by on their way to somewhere more useful. The valley sat in a kind of bowl. You had to enter from the east through a notch in the ridgeline, barely wide enough for a wagon to pass. And once you were inside, the hills closed up around you on 3 sides. There was one road in and one road out, and they were the same road. The west side climbed into rougher country, where nobody had ever bothered to live. All rock and laurel, and the kind of pine that grows in soil too poor to keep cleared. The east side fell off toward Murchison Hollow, which was the nearest neighbor, and a hard 2 hours by horse in good weather. The valley had been settled by Welsh and Cornish families in the 1780s, miners mostly, who had come up out of the older settlements along the river to try their luck with the small veins of iron and copper that ran under those hills. The veins had played out by the 1830s. The miners had stayed. The next generation became farmers. The generation after that, by the 1880s, had become something else again, a kind of people that the lowland Pennsylvanians did not entirely recognize. Quieter, more watchful, slower to invite a stranger into their houses. I tell you this because the people of Yarrow Pass were not strangers to the valley they lived in. Their families had been there for 4 generations. They knew that valley the way you know the floor of your own kitchen at night. They knew which stones in the creek were loose and which were not. They knew which trees the lightning preferred. They knew, if anyone did, what was theirs and what was not. On the morning of October the 29th, 1881, a circuit preacher named Algernon Whitlock rode into Yarrow Pass to give a service he'd given 7 times before that month in 7 other valleys. He'd been on the road since dawn. He arrived around 9:30. The first thing he noticed was that the bell at the meeting house wasn't ringing. The second was that the road through town was empty. Not just quiet, empty. There were chickens in some of the yards, and a few had wandered into the road, which they wouldn't have done if anyone was around. There was smoke coming from one chimney, but only one. The pump at the center of the square was still running, which meant someone had been there recently enough to work the handle. But the bucket beneath it was overflowing, and the water was spilling into the dirt, and had been for some time. He sat on his horse in the middle of the road for a while. He told himself in those first minutes the kinds of things a sensible man tells himself. That there was a barn raising he hadn't been told about. That a wedding had taken everyone over to the next valley. That a death in some prominent family had drawn the town to a wake. There were a dozen ordinary reasons why a small valley town might be quiet on a Saturday morning, and he tried in good faith to settle on one of them. The trouble was, all of those reasons would have left at least one person in town. An old aunt too sick to travel. A neighbor posted at the pump to keep an eye on things. A husband sleeping off a Friday night in his own bed. 312 people did not all go to a wedding. 312 people did not all go to anything. He got down off his horse. Then he walked to the meeting house. The door was unlocked. There was no one inside. The hymn books were open on the pews, which was odd for a Saturday. And there was a half-eaten piece of bread on the lectern, where he himself would have stood. The bread was still soft. The candles in the sconces were burned down about 1.5 inches, which suggested someone had lit them recently and hadn't gotten around to blowing them out. He went next door to the general store. It was unlocked, too. There were 2 cups of coffee on the counter, gone cold but not yet skinned over. The cash drawer was open. There was a ledger left mid-entry, with the pencil still resting in the crease. The last line in the ledger, in a careful hand, read 4 lb of nails to L. Penhallow on account. And the pencil had stopped before the price could be written in. He went to the smith's house. The forge was still warm. He could feel it from the doorway. There was a horseshoe on the anvil, finished, the metal black now but recently red. The smith's leather apron was hanging on a peg by the door, which was strange. A smith does not leave his apron behind, not when there is work on the anvil. He went to 7 more houses. The same thing in each of them, cooked food on tables, beds made, laundry on lines. In one kitchen, a kettle was still warm to the touch. In another, a knife had been left on a cutting board next to half a turnip. In a third, an old leather-bound Bible was open on a table by the window, with a thumb pressed into the page at Ezekiel chapter 37. The Valley of the Dry Bones. He noted that one. He couldn't stop himself from noting it. There were dogs in some of the yards, and they came to him whining, which was the only sound he'd heard since he arrived. He counted 6 dogs by the time he came back to the square. Not one of them barked. They followed him at a distance of about 10 feet. And when he stopped, they stopped. And when he moved, they moved. He told the sheriff later that he could not remember ever feeling so watched by anything in his life. He said the dogs were not the things doing the watching. He said the dogs were doing what he was doing, looking for whatever it was that was watching them both. By the time he got back to his horse, it was just after 11 in the morning, and he had searched roughly a quarter of the town. Yarrow Pass had 312 people in it the night before. He could account for none of them. He rode hard to the next valley over, a place called Murchison Hollow. And from there, a rider was sent down to the county seat in Hephzibah. And by the late afternoon, a small party of men had come back up the road with him. There were 6 of them. The county sheriff was named Octavius Mead. He was 47 that year. A heavy, set man with a thick brown mustache he kept neatly trimmed even in the country, where most men didn't bother. And he had the kind of mind that wanted explanations and didn't trust silence. He'd been a soldier in the war, and he'd seen towns emptied by disease, by raid, by fire. He knew what those looked like. This was not that. The party arrived in Yarrow Pass just as the sun was setting. Whitlock had not exaggerated. The town was untouched. Nothing was broken, nothing was burned, nothing was overturned. There were no bodies in the houses, no blood on any of the floors, no signs of struggle in any room they entered. The cattle were still in their pens, the horses still in their stables. A pie that had been left to cool on a kitchen windowsill at the Huff farmhouse was now stone cold, but otherwise perfect, with 2 flies on the crust. It was, Sheriff Mead would write later in a report that no one outside his office would read for the next 22 years, as if every soul in the valley had been called away to dinner and simply forgotten to come back. The sheriff did the work a sheriff does. He had his men split the town into quarters. He had each man take a quarter and walk it slowly with a lantern, calling names. He had them check every house, every barn, every cellar, every outhouse. He had them check the cisterns. He had them check the haylofts. He had one man, a deputy named Jerome Wickham, climb the bell tower of the meeting house and look out across the rooftops in case there was something to see from up high. There was not. He himself walked the road from the eastern notch, back into the center of the town slowly, looking down at the dirt. He was looking for footprints. He told the coroner later that he was looking for the prints of 312 people walking somewhere together, because 312 people cannot move through a valley like that without leaving a road behind them like a trampled wheat field. He did not find any. The road into Yarrow Pass that evening was the same road it had been any other Saturday. A few horse tracks. The wheel ruts from the post wagon 2 days before. Nothing else. He told the coroner that this was the moment he understood that whatever had happened in that valley had not happened in any way that he, as a sheriff, knew how to investigate. There were no tracks, because nothing that walked on the surface of the earth had carried them away. He didn't know what that meant. He didn't want to know what that meant. But standing in the middle of the road at sunset with the empty houses on either side of him and the dogs whining at his heels, he understood it. By full dark, they had searched roughly half the houses. They lit lamps. They worked in pairs. They called names into the dark. The dogs followed them around with their tails low. Around 9 in the evening, one of the deputies, a young man named Phineas Marbury, came back to the square at a run. He had been searching the western edge of the town, where the road curved up toward the higher pasture. There was an old stone well there on what had been the property of a man named Ulysses Cobbett. The well was deep, 60 feet by local reckoning. It hadn't been the primary well in town. The Cobbetts had stopped using it a few years before, when a new pump had been installed closer to the house, and now it served mostly to water livestock that grazed in the upper field. The deputy had walked past it twice without thinking anything of it. The third time, he held his lantern over the lip and looked down. He didn't say what he saw when he got back to the square. He just told the sheriff he needed to come. He had taken his hat off somewhere between the well and the square. He was holding it in both hands in front of him, the way a man holds a hat at a funeral. The sheriff would remember that detail for the rest of his life. The deputy was 23 years old, a strong young man from a farming family, and he had taken his hat off and was holding it like a man at a graveside, and his face in the lantern light was the gray, white color of old ash. I want you to understand something about that well. It was an old well even in 1881. Local history said it had been dug sometime in the 1780s, when the first European families had come into that valley, and the stones around its mouth were soft with moss and bore the chisel marks of men who had been dead 100 years. The well sat about 120 yards from the nearest house. There was a small wooden cover had been kept on it for safety on hinges with a latch. The latch was still latched when the deputy first saw it. He had to open it himself to look down. Whatever was in that well had been put in there carefully. That is the part that bothered Octavius Mead. Most in the years he had to think about it. Not the impossibility of moving 312 people in the dark and silence without breaking a single window or knocking a single chair out of place. Not the impossibility of moving them all to one spot at one time with no struggle. But the fact that the lid had been closed when it was over. That somebody or something had taken the time to latch it. A breath here before what comes next. If this voice is one you'd want to spend more time with, I keep a longer collection. The hollow files. 10 cases. 5 hours. The same kind of quiet trouble I'm telling you about now. The link is in the description below and pinned at the top of the comments. Let's go back to the story. The sheriff did not bring his men down into the well that night. He posted a guard at the lip and rode hard for Hephzibah, and was back by dawn with 3 more men, 2 long ropes, a pulley rig, and the county coroner, a quiet, patient man named Tobias Quennell, who had been doing autopsies in that part of the state for 19 years, and had the steady hands of a man who had seen most of what a body could do to itself. They rigged the pulley over the well at first light. Quennell volunteered to go down first. He was lowered with a lantern and a length of rope tied around his waist, and he was 40 feet down before he called for the men above to stop. He stayed at that depth for almost 10 minutes without saying anything. When he was finally raised back up, his face was the color of paper, and his hands, which had been steady going down, were shaking when they came back up to the light. He sat on the wall of the well for a long while before he could speak. When he did, all he said was, "They are all in there. Every one of them. 312 people in a well 60 feet, deep with a mouth no wider than 4 feet across. I want you to sit with the geometry of that for a moment. The space inside a well 60 feet deep and 4 feet wide is, by rough calculation, about 750 cubic feet. The volume of 312 adult bodies, even pressed together with no room between them, is somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 cubic feet, give or take. The two numbers do not match. They cannot match. You cannot put 312 people into 750 cubic feet of space. The math will not allow it. And yet, according to the men who went down that well over the next 4 days, they were all there. Every single one of them. I have, in writing this, gone back and forth with myself about that detail. I have wondered whether the coroner miscounted, or whether the sheriff exaggerated, or whether the well was deeper than local reckoning had it. I have looked at the original report from 1881, and I've looked at the recovery log that Coleman Yetter kept, and I have looked at the surveyor's measurements that were taken in 1904. When the state was first considering acquiring the land, and they all say the same thing. The well was 60 feet deep. The mouth was 4 feet across. The bottom widened slightly in the way old wells sometimes do, but not enough to matter. The numbers do not work. And yet, the bodies were there, all of them, counted, named, and laid out in the meeting house in rows on the wooden floor. There is, of course, an obvious objection, you will say, and I would say it if I were listening to this, that the simplest explanation is that there were not 312 people in that well, that the count was wrong somewhere. That 10 or 20 of the people of Yarrow Pass had walked out of the valley that night under their own power, and that the count at the well was made up to match the census. I considered this. I would like to believe it. The trouble is that the original census, which I have also looked at, was made in March of 1881 and lists every person in Yarrow Pass by full name and age, and the recovery log, which Coroner Quennell kept in his own hand over those 4 days, also lists everybody by name and age. identified by what each body was wearing and by who in the recovery party recognized the face. The two lists match. Each name on one appears on the other. There is no one in the census who does not appear in the recovery log, and there is no one in the recovery log who does not appear in the census. The numbers do not work, and the names match. Both things are true. I have no explanation for this. I am telling you what the documents say. The coroner wrote in a private letter he sent to his brother in Philadelphia 6 weeks later. A letter that was preserved by the family and only made public in 1947. That the bodies were arranged. That was the word he used. Not stacked, not thrown, not piled. Arranged. He said they were placed with their heads turned in the same direction. All of them facing what would have been east, if you were standing at the bottom of that well. And that none of them were tangled. None of them were overlapping in any way that a careful man working slowly with his own hands would have done it. He wrote that it had the look of something done by hand, slow and patient. The way a clockmaker lines up the small parts on a felt cloth before he begins his work. He wrote, and I'm going to quote this carefully because the wording matters, that the impression he had, standing at the bottom of that well, at the end of the second day, was that whoever had done it had not been in a hurry, and had not been alone, and had wanted very much for it to be tidy. He never went back into that well after the recovery was done. He retired from the coroner's office in 1884. He moved to a small house on the Schuylkill River, and he raised honeybees for the last 26 years of his life. And his wife told her sister in a letter that was found among her effects after her own death, that he would not allow any deep container in the house. Not a cistern, not a rain barrel, not even a flower vase taller than a hand's breadth. She wrote that he would sometimes wake at night and ask her quietly if she could hear something coming up from underneath the floorboards, and that he had a habit, when he was reading in the parlor, of glancing down at his own feet every few minutes as if he were checking to make sure they were still there. Now, the recovery. It took 4 days. 43 men were involved in it before it was done. Each man went down for no more than half an hour at a time. There were 2 who refused to go down a second time, and 1 who came up after his first descent and walked off into the woods without his hat and was not seen in Hephzibah County again. The sheriff did not pursue him. He wrote in his report that he believed the man had a right to go where he wanted after what he had been asked to do. I want to tell you about one of the men who went down. His name was Coleman Yetter. He was a stonemason from Hephzibah, 34 years old, who had been hired for the recovery because he was strong and because he knew how to brace a shaft. He went down into the Cobbett well a total of 7 times over the 4 days. He brought up 9 of the bodies himself. He kept a small leather-bound notebook in which he wrote what he called his accounts, by which he meant his private thoughts, and the notebook was sold at auction with the rest of his estate in 1906 and bought by a private collector in Pittsburgh. And from there it eventually passed into the hands of the Pennsylvania Historical Commission, which is where I read it. Coleman Yetter wrote in his notebook that the well was warmer at the bottom than it should have been. He wrote that the air at the bottom of a well in late October in Pennsylvania ought to be cold enough to mist the breath. He wrote that the air at the bottom of the Cobbett well was, in his words, the temperature of a kitchen with a stove burning in it. He wrote that he could not figure out where the heat was coming from. The walls were cold. The water at the bottom was cold. The bodies, when he touched them, were cold. But the air in that space, the air he was breathing, was warm. And when he came back up to the surface and stood beside the well in the October air. He could feel the warmth coming up out of the lip of the well, like the warmth from an oven door that had just been opened. He wrote that he could not stop thinking about it. He wrote that on the third night, after they had stopped work for the day, he walked back to the well alone after dark and stood beside it and put his hand over the lip and felt the warm air rising. He wrote that he stood there for a long time. He wrote that he heard nothing. But he wrote that he had the feeling the whole time that something at the bottom of the well was holding very still, and that if he leaned too far over the lip, it would not be holding still anymore. Coleman Yetter went back down the well the next morning anyway. He went down 2 more times after that. He finished the job he had been paid to do. He drew his wages and rode back to Hefzibah, and never spoke of it to anyone. But he wrote in the last entry in that notebook concerning Yarrow Pass that he was going to give up well work for the rest of his life. And he did. He never went down another shaft. When his grown son years later asked him to help dig a well on a piece of land the family had bought, Coleman Yetter said no, and he would not say why. And the son did the work himself with a hired neighbor. That was one man. There were 42 others. The bodies were brought up one at a time with the rope and the pulley, wrapped in canvas. They were laid out in the meeting house, because it was the only building in Yarrow Pass big enough to hold them all, and Coroner Quennell catalogued each one as it came up. He had a register from the local census, which had been updated only the previous spring. Every name on that register was accounted for. The blacksmith Cassius Renfro, the seamstress Loveday Penhallow, the constable who had not done his job, the Hupshire sisters who served as midwives, the Cobbett family who had owned the well, the 2 old sisters who ran the post office, the Hupp family with the pie cooling on their windowsill. All of them. There was no one missing. There was also, and this is the detail that the sheriff put in the second paragraph of his report, no obvious cause of death on any of them. No wounds, no bruises, no marks of strangulation, no signs of poison that the coroner could identify with the tools he had. No water in the lungs, though the well had about 3 feet of water at the bottom, and the lower bodies had been submerged. No broken bones, except for 2 cases, both elderly and both consistent with old injuries that had healed badly years before. They were just dead. 312 people in apparently good health on the evening of October the 28th, and dead by the morning of the 29th, with no marks on them, and no apparent reason, and arranged at the bottom of a well that could not have held them. The coroner went through each body twice. He was a methodical man. On the second pass, he did note one consistent feature. He wrote it down in the formal report, in a single sentence, and then he never spoke of it again. He wrote that the eyes of every single person in that well were open, and that they were all looking up. Now, the official explanation. The county did not want this story to leave the county. You have to understand the practical reality of 1881. The railroad was making its decisions about where to extend its lines in that part of Pennsylvania. There were investors. There were plans for new mines 2 valleys over. A story like this, even with no clear cause, could do real economic damage to an area that was already losing people to better land further west. Sheriff Mead and his superiors made what they considered a reasonable choice. They wrote up the incident as a fever. A wasting fever of unknown origin that had passed through Yarrow Pass in a single night and taken everyone in it. The bodies were buried in a single mass grave just east of the meeting house. The town was left standing. The houses were left with their contents. The Cobbett well was filled in with stones and sealed at the top with mortar. And a small fence was put around it. The road into Yarrow Pass was officially closed by the county the following spring on the grounds that the buildings were a hazard. There was, of course, a problem with the fever story. A wasting fever does not move 312 people into a well. A wasting fever leaves bodies in beds. A wasting fever leaves bodies in chairs and on floors and slumped against door frames where they were trying to get to somewhere with air. It does not arrange them at the bottom of a sealed well in a column 60 feet high, with their eyes open looking up. The men who had been on the recovery team knew this. They had lifted those bodies. They had wrapped them in canvas one by one, and they had counted them, and they had been there. The sheriff dealt with this problem by asking each of the 43 men individually in his office in Hephzibah not to speak about what they had seen. He did not threaten them. He did not pay them more than the wage they had been promised. He simply asked. He told them. The coroner wrote later that there were things in the world that the world was not yet ready to have explained to it, and that whatever had taken the people of Yarrow Pass might be one of them. And that if the story got out, all that would happen was that more people would come to that valley looking, and that whatever was there might find more it could take. He asked them not to give it more. Most of them agreed. There were 43 men after all, and only one had to break the silence for the silence to be broken. The fact that it was not broken in the way it could have been broken for 22 years tells you something about what those men had seen. Tells you something about what they had agreed to keep quiet about. Tells you something about how badly they did not want the rest of their lives to be the man who had let it out. When the story finally was released in 1903, it was not by any of those men. They were mostly old by then or dead. It was Sheriff Mead himself in his last year in office who allowed the original report to be made public. He was 69 years old. He had been carrying the report in his own safe, in his own office for 22 years. He told a young reporter from the Philadelphia Inquirer that he was making the report public because he did not want it to die with him. He said that if he died, the safe would be opened and the report would be read by someone who had not been there, and that person would not know what to do with it. He wanted, while he could still answer questions about it, for someone to know what was in it. The reporter, whose name was Cyprian Ardmore, took the report and read it twice, and went back to his editor in Philadelphia, and the story ran on page 4 of the Sunday edition of the Inquirer on the 3rd of May, 1903. It ran under the headline, A Mountain Mystery, now 22 years old. It was reprinted in 7 other papers across the eastern half of the country over the following 10 days. And then, the way these things did at the turn of the century, the story passed out of the newspapers and into the kind of half-memory that small regional stories pass into. There was no follow-up investigation. There was no government inquiry. The sheriff retired the following year. The report was filed in the county records, and as far as I can tell, has not been formally opened by anyone since 1976, when a graduate student in folklore at the University of Pittsburgh requested it and was given a partial copy. Within 10 years of 1881, the forest had taken most of the valley back. By the time the report was made public in 1903, when Sheriff Mead was an old man and willing to let his name be attached to the story, there was almost nothing left of Yarrow Pass to see. The meeting house roof had collapsed. The general store had been pulled down for its boards. The bell from the meeting house had been moved to a different church, in a different valley, and the people in that valley did not know where it had come from, only that it had been a gift. The well itself was still there. It is still there now, as far as I know, sealed, fenced, on private land, The family that owns the land has, by all accounts, never opened it. Now, that is what is in the public record, more or less. It is, I will tell you, not the strangest part of the story. I want to tell you about a man named Wendell Garrick. Wendell Garrick was 26 years old in the autumn of 1881. He was a surveyor, which means he was paid to walk the land with chains and compasses and write down what he found there. He worked for the state of Pennsylvania, mapping the unincorporated regions of the central counties. In late September of that year, about a month before the disappearance, he was sent into the country around Yarrow Pass to confirm the property lines of 3 farms whose boundaries were in dispute. He stayed in Yarrow Pass for 9 days. He kept a journal. He kept journals all his life. They were donated by his estate to the Historical Society in Carlisle, Pennsylvania in 1938, and they sat in a cardboard box on a shelf in that society's archive for 62 years before a graduate student named Maricela Vasquez Cohen, who was researching the history of Appalachian surveying practices, opened the box, found the journal from the autumn of 1881, and read what was written in it. I have a transcript of the journal in front of me. I'm going to read you a few entries. September the 23rd. Arrived in Yarrow Pass after a hard ride from Murchison Hollow. Lodging with the family of one Ulysses Cobbett, who has a clean spare room and asks only 20 cents a night. The valley is pleasant. The air is good. The people seem agreeable. The country is more isolated than I had expected. There is no telegraph. The post comes once a week. September the 25th. Walked the eastern line of the Renfrew property today. There is a discrepancy of some 40 feet between the deeded line and the actual fence, in favor of the neighboring tract. I have noted this and will raise it with the parties involved. The Smith Renfrew is an affable man. He gave me coffee. September the 27th. Strange business at the Cobbett well today. The hired man, a fellow named Hosea Pettit, was drawing water for the upper pasture and reports that the bucket came up empty 3 times before it filled. He says he could hear no splash when he let it down. Cobbett tells me this happens sometimes, and that the water level in that well moves on its own. I find this hard to credit, but I am not a man of these mountains, and I will trust him on the matter of his own well. September the 29th. Slept poorly. I have been having the same dream for 3 nights now. In the dream, I am standing in the meeting house in the middle of the day, but there is no light coming through the windows. The whole town is in the meeting house with me. We are all of us looking at the same thing, but I cannot turn my head to see what it is. I can only look at the faces of the others, and they are all of them looking up. October the 1st. Spoke to Mrs. Penhallow today about a question of property. She is a sensible woman. She mentioned, without my asking, that the dogs in town have been quiet for the last week. She says she has not heard a dog bark at night since the new moon. She thinks the foxes have moved on, but she does not seem to believe it herself. October the 2nd. I am leaving in the morning. I am writing this by the light of a single candle, and I am writing it because I cannot sleep, and I have to tell someone. Even if the someone is only this book. There is a sound in this valley at night. I did not hear it the first 3 nights. I have heard it every night since. It comes from somewhere west of the Cobbett property, somewhere up toward the high pasture, but I cannot place it more exactly than that. It is not an animal. It is not water. It is, if I must describe it, the sound of a great many people speaking very quietly at a great distance, all at the same time. The words are not clear. I have tried to make them out and I cannot, but there is a rhythm to it. It rises and falls. It pauses. It begins again. I asked Cobbett this morning, casually, if he had ever heard anything strange at night. He looked at me for a long while. Then he said, in the slow way these mountain people have, when they are choosing every word, that the valley had its own habits, and that a man who slept in it for a season learned to keep his window shut after dark. I will keep my window shut tonight. I will leave in the morning. I will not come back to this valley. October the 3rd. Left Yarrow Pass at first light. I have not slept. I will write more when I am somewhere else. That is the last entry in the journal from September and October of 1881. Wendell Garrick did not return to Yarrow Pass. He never spoke publicly about what he had heard there. He continued to work as a surveyor in eastern Pennsylvania for the rest of his career, though he refused after 1881 any contract that would have taken him into the western part of the state. He married a woman named Cordelia Frome in 1885, and they had a long, by all accounts, happy life together. He died in 1929. He was 74 years old. Cordelia Frome Garrick lived until 1946. Her own diary, which is also at the Historical Society in Carlisle, contains a number of entries about her husband. She wrote that he was a kind man and a careful one, and that he loved her and she loved him. She also wrote that for the 44 years of their marriage, he insisted that the window in their bedroom be shut every single night, regardless of the season. He would check it himself before he came to bed. She wrote that, on the few occasions when she had forgotten and left it cracked open, he had risen quietly and shut it without speaking to her about it, and that he had then sat for a while on the edge of the bed with his hand pressed flat against the wood of the windowsill, as if he were holding something down. She wrote in the entry for the night of his death that the last thing he said to her was that he could hear them coming. He did not say who. So, you have, between Quennell's letter and Garrick's journal and Mrs. Garrick's diary, 3 private accounts that suggest something the official record never said. That the people of Yarrow Pass were not surprised. That on some level they knew that something in that valley had been calling to them for a while. Slowly. Quietly. The way you would call a dog you didn't want to startle. And that on the night of October the 28th, 1881, that thing finished the calling and the people went. All of them. 312, to a well 60 feet deep and 4 feet wide that could not have held them. And someone, or something, latched the lid behind them. The land where Yarrow Pass once stood is now part of a state game commission tract. It is open to hunters during the appropriate seasons. There is a small dirt road that leads in from the county road, and if you follow it for about 1.5 miles, you can find the foundation stones of a few buildings half buried in moss. There is the outline of what was once the meeting house. There is the stone hearth of what was once the Renfrew Forge. About 120 yards from the meeting house, in a small clearing surrounded by second-growth oak, there is a low-wrought iron fence. Inside the fence is a circular stone mound about 4 feet across, sealed at the top with old gray mortar. There is no marker. There is no plaque. The State Game Commission has, over the years, received several proposals to remove the fence and the mound entirely on the grounds that they constitute a historical curiosity that may attract trespass. The proposals have always been declined. There is a clause in the original land transfer from the county to the state in 1915 that requires the mound to remain undisturbed in perpetuity. The reason given for the clause in the document is fragmentary. The handwriting is poor. But as near as anyone has been able to read it, the clause states that the mound is to remain closed because the land's previous owners had reason to believe, and I want to read this carefully, that something below the surface in that location should not be allowed easy passage upward. That is the wording in the document. Easy passage upward. I have spent some time in writing this story, trying to find out whether anyone in modern times has gone down into that well. I cannot find any record that they have. There are no archaeological surveys. There are no geological reports. The State Game Commission, when contacted, will tell you that the well is on land they manage, but that they have no specific information about it, and that any inquiry should be directed to the County Historical Society in Hephzibah. The County Historical Society, when contacted, will tell you that the well is not their property, that the matter is closed, and that the events of 1881 were the result of an epidemic of unknown origin that was thoroughly investigated at the time. They will say it with the same wording every time. I have called them twice. The wording was identical on both calls. There is one more thing I want to tell you. In the autumn of 1907, 26 years after the disappearance, a man named Asher Mountjoy was hunting deer on what was then private land on the old Yarrow Pass tract. He was a guest of the landowner. He was, by all accounts, an experienced woodsman who had grown up in those mountains and was not given to fancy. He came back to the landowner's house in the late afternoon, 3 hours before he had been expected, walked into the kitchen without taking off his boots, sat down at the table, and asked for a cup of coffee. The landowner's wife, who told this story to her granddaughter decades later, said that Asher Mountjoy did not speak for almost 20 minutes. He just sat at the table with both his hands around the coffee cup. His rifle was leaning against the wall behind him. He had not unloaded it. When he finally spoke, he said that he had been crossing the upper pasture near the old well when he had heard something he could not place. He said it was a sound like a great many people speaking very quietly at a great distance, all at the same time. He said he could not make out the words, but that there was a rhythm to it. He said it rose and fell. He said it paused. He said it began again. He said that as he stood there listening, he became absolutely certain of two things. He said this in the kitchen of his hostess with a coffee cup in his hand, and she remembered the words precisely enough to repeat them to her granddaughter 60 years later. The first thing he was certain of, he said, was that the sound was coming from inside the well. The second was that whatever was speaking down there knew his name. Asher Mountjoy left the county that night. He took the late train south. He did not return. His descendants still live in Pennsylvania. One of them, a woman named Henrietta Mountjoy Caruth, was kind enough to speak with me briefly about her great-grandfather's story. She confirmed the family tradition, more or less as her grandmother had told it to her. She said that the family had passed down a single rule about that part of the state, which was simply that no Mountjoy was to set foot in Hephzibah County at any time for any reason, in any season. She said the rule had been followed without exception for 4 generations. When I asked her what she thought had been in the well, she paused for a long time. Then she said, "I don't think it was ever just one thing. I think it was already there when we got here. I think the people in that valley figured out, slowly, how to keep it down. And then one night they stopped being able to." I asked her what she thought happened to the people of Yarrow Pass. She said, "I think they went down to it. I think they had to. I think it was the only thing they could do when they couldn't keep it down anymore." I asked her if she thought it was still there. She said, "Why would it have left? I'll tell you one more thing and then I'll stop. In Murchison Hollow, which was the next valley over, the one the preacher rode out of on the morning of October the 29th, there lived a family named Sturbridge. They had a farm at the head of the hollow, the highest farm in the valley, set against the western ridge that separated their valley from Yarrow Pass. From their kitchen window, on a clear day, You could see the smoke of the Yarrow Pass chimneys rising over the saddle. The Sturbridge farmhouse is still standing. It is privately owned. The family that lives there now descends directly from the original Sturbridges, 4 generations down. The current owner is a woman named Pernilla Sturbridge Haywood, who is in her late 60s. She is a retired county librarian. She lives there with her husband, who is a quiet man with bad hearing and a good garden. When I called her in the spring of last year to ask if there was any family history about the night the people of Yarrow Pass disappeared, she was silent for a long while. Then she said, yes, there was a family story. She told me she had not thought of it in 20 years. Her great-grandfather, a man named Lavinia Sturbridge, who would have been 31 years old in 1881, had written about that night in a farm journal that the family still had. She offered to read it to me over the telephone. I asked if she could send me a photograph of the page instead, and she did, the next afternoon, a careful image taken on her kitchen table in the morning light. The entry is dated October the 28th, 1881, not the morning of the 29th. The evening of the 28th, the night it happened. I am going to read it to you. Cold day. Brought the last of the corn in. Annalise is poorly with her chest again, and I have sent for the Hupshire woman over in Yarrow Pass to come look at her in the morning if she can. About sundown, there was a sound from over the ridge that I cannot account for. Annalise heard it too. The dogs would not come out of the barn. It was not a sound like any animal I have ever heard. It was not wind. It was not water. It was, if I must say, like the singing of a great crowd of people very far away. Only the words were not words, and the singing was not singing, and the sound rose and fell in the way a tide does 3 times before it stopped. After it stopped, the whole valley was so quiet that I could hear my own heartbeat in my own ears. I have not heard the like before, and I do not wish to again. Annalise is asleep now. I will not sleep. I will sit up with the rifle. I will write more in the morning if there is more to write. There is no entry for October the 29th. The next entry in the journal is dated October the 31st. 3 days later. It reads in fulls. The people of Yarrow Pass are all dead. Wetlock came down at first light yesterday, and the sheriff has gone up. Annalise is no better. I will write no more about the past. The farm journal continues in its normal way, with weather and crops and the small business of a farm. For another 32 years, until Lavinia Sturbridge died in 1913. He never wrote another word about Yarrow Pass. He never wrote another word about the sound he heard on the night of October the 28th. But his great-granddaughter told me on the telephone that there was a family rule on that farm that had been passed down for 4 generations, the same way the Mountjoy family had the rule. She said the rule was that you close the kitchen window before sunset on the 28th of October every year. She said she still did it. She said she did not know exactly why. She said her grandmother had told her, when she was a young woman, that it was for the singing, and that her grandmother had said no more than that. But that the look in her grandmother's eyes when she said it had been enough to make the rule hold. She said it was a small thing. She said her husband thought she was foolish. She said she did it anyway. She said that one year, about 10 years ago, she had forgotten. She had been distracted. There had been a death in the family that week. A cousin. And she had not been thinking about the date. She had been doing the dishes after supper with the window open, the way she did most evenings in early autumn, and her husband had been in the next room with the radio on. She said she remembered standing at the sink with her hands in the soapy water and feeling all the small hairs at the back of her neck rise at once. She said it was the way an animal feels when something has come up behind it. She said she did not hear anything. She said she felt somehow that she had almost heard something, that a sound had begun somewhere on the other side of the ridge and had not been able to come the rest of the way because she had not opened the door for it. She said she closed the window so fast she cracked one of the small panes. She showed me the pane on a video call later, still cracked, still in the frame. She said her husband had come in from the next room and asked her if she was all right, and that she had told him yes, and that she had stood there at the sink for a long time afterward with her hands still in the water until the soapsuds had gone cold and her fingers had gone white. She said she has never forgotten the date again. She said she will not forget it. She said that on the night of October the 28th every year, just after sunset, she stands at her kitchen window with her hands flat on the glass for about a minute. She does not know why she does this, either. She thinks it is something her grandmother used to do. She says she has the feeling, when she does it, that she is holding something shut. She told me, before we hung up, that the only reason she had told me any of this was that she was getting older and her own daughter had moved away to Ohio. And her daughter's family did not know the rule, and she did not know who to tell, and she did not want the rule to be forgotten. When she was gone, she asked me, please, if I told this story, to tell people the rule, to say it out loud. So, here is the rule. If you live in central Pennsylvania, in the ridge country west of Hefzibah, in any of the small farmhouses on the slopes that look toward the empty valley of Yarrow Pass, close your kitchen window before sunset on the 28th of October every year without fail. She said it could not hurt. She said it might help. She said she did not know. That is the story of Yarrow Pass, Pennsylvania, in October of 1881. 312 people in a well that could not have held them, arranged like figures on a shelf with their eyes open, looking up. No cause of death, no signs of struggle. The lid closed and latched behind them. A coroner who could not sleep near deep water for the rest of his life. A surveyor who shut his bedroom window every night for 44 years. A hunter who heard his own name spoken from underground by what sounded like a crowd. I do not have an explanation for you. I have read everything I could find about that valley, and I have made the calls, and I have walked the road in. I was there last autumn, in fact, in the clearing with the iron fence. I stood there for about 10 minutes. I did not hear anything. The light was good. There were no clouds. The mound was just a mound. The fence was just a fence. I'll tell you the only thing I noticed, and you can do with it what you will. The moss on the stones of the mound was thicker on the east side, which is the side, if you are standing on the mound and looking down, where the bodies were facing. I went home after that. I haven't been back. If you've ever stood in a place where you knew, on some level below thought, that you weren't really alone, tell me about it. Just leave it in the comments. I want to read them. I want to know the places you've been. If a story like this one is the kind you'd want more of, the Hollow Files is in the description. 10 of them, 5 hours. The same voice and the same kind of quiet. The link is also pinned in the comments. Stay with us for the next one. I'll see you then.